Alina was exhausted by the time she found the hidden manuscript. It had been a week since she accepted an assignment from the Museum of Antiquities, an ordinary commission on the surface. They wanted her to translate a document recently unearthed at a remote excavation site in the Middle East. She was intrigued by the archaic script, which resembled a blend of ancient Aramaic and some unknown dialect. The museum's curator had handed over a digitally scanned copy, telling her it was found tucked into an earthen jar in a collapsed temple corridor. He had neglected to mention the sinister rumors surrounding the text. Perhaps he wasn't aware of them, or perhaps he had decided not to burden her with ominous stories. Yet from the moment Alina opened the file, she sensed something was off. The words on the page felt alive, shifting, almost pulsing, as though they had a heartbeat of their own. Initially, Alina chalked it up to her fatigue. She had been working long hours on another project, and the strain on her tired eyes was possibly making the letters dance. But even after a full night's rest, something still seemed to stir whenever she looked at those incomprehensible symbols. She would stare intently, trying to parse meaning from the conjoined strokes, feeling a creeping unease as if she were being watched. The digital scans weren't of the best resolution, so she asked for higher quality images. Meanwhile, the museum courier actually brought her the original parchment, so fragile it had to be kept under special conditions. When Alina saw it in person, she suspected the document might be older than what the museum had estimated. That night, she spread out the parchment on her white oak desk and carefully angled her lamp, adjusting the glow. The characters glistened with a faint golden sheen. The corners were frayed and flaking, the edges riddled with small tears. She had her language references arranged in neat piles, along with her notepads and laptop. Her mission? Decode a text that had perplexed other translators. The curator hoped Alina's expertise with Semitic languages would yield answers. She'd handled old scripts before, and each time the routine was the same: identify patterns, map them onto known alphabets, gauge linguistic evolution. She'd done so with an academic's calm, but now a strange anxiety burrowed in her chest. It was the sense that this text was more than just archaic. It was forbidden, as if it harbored secrets that no one was meant to unearth. She began by matching recurring symbols. She noticed references to an entity named Zahar, repeated often, embedded within cryptic incantations. A half-buried line about the waking tomb made her shiver. Another described the merciless severing of blood ties and the roaming horrors in the Valley of Shrieking Winds. Though initially detached from the meaning, Alina found herself unable to dismiss the vivid mental images conjured by the text. In one section, she discerned a phrase describing the vessels of time, apparently objects that could grant glimpses of ancient events. Whether metaphor or literal artifact, it wasn't entirely clear. Yet as she read further, her heart pounded. She felt a presence behind her, a stirring of the air in her apartment. A fleeting moment of dread made the hairs on her neck stand on end. She spun around, half expecting to find someone lurking. Of course, no one was there, just her own reflection in a window across the room. But the ambiance changed after that first session. She found it increasingly difficult to sleep, plagued by nightmares reminiscent of lines she'd read in the scroll. Once, she dreamed of a vast desert plain under a burning sun, encircled by towering gray columns. Hooded figures chanted in guttural syllables that reverberated in her bones. Upon waking, her heart hammered so violently she pinched her arm to make sure she was awake. She wrote it off as a particularly vivid nightmare, though it reinforced her conviction that the text was affecting her mind. The next day, Alina visited the museum's archives to consult complementary resources. She hoped to cross-reference parallels in ancient inscriptions. The curator directed her to an archivist named Samir, who led her to a quiet room lit by overhead lamps that gave everything a slightly yellowish hue. The musty smell of old tomes and the hush of the sealed environment provided a welcome respite from the outside bustle. She spent hours combing through aging translations and half-deciphered languages. Nothing matched precisely. She discovered faint similarities with a 9th century BC script from northern Africa, but that lead proved inconclusive. Frustrated, Elena took a break and sipped coffee from a paper cup. She mentioned to Samir that the text mentioned Tsar, and he looked up, eyebrows arched. That name surfaces in certain esoteric legends. Something about an ancient horror that devours knowledge, if I recall. But where did you see it? She hesitated. The museum's instructions were to remain discreet about the text's specifics, yet Samir was an ally. In hushed tones, she explained that it was a repeated phrase in a crucial portion of the parchment. Samir scratched a few quick notes on a pad. He could try to probe deeper into the archives, possibly find a link. The tension in her skull eased slightly. Maybe if they identified who or what Zahar was supposed to be, she could better understand the entire text. That evening, she returned to her apartment, sinking into her chair with the parchment spread out before her. Traffic noise from outside drifted through her open window. A siren wailed in the distance, half lost among echoes of footsteps. Her eyes landed on a passage describing the rift of time parted, and there, a phrase, "Beware the words that wake." That line lodged itself in her mind. She read it again and again. Something about it felt like a warning, a direct admonition to whoever dared read these lines. Elena tested a new approach to translation. She read the passages slowly, nearly chanting them, to detect possible linguistic rhythms. At the same time, she pressed record on her phone to capture her voice. She was alone in the hush of her small living room, the only light cast by her desk lamp. As she intoned the syllables, her voice seemed to echo unpleasantly in the confined space. She shivered. An unnerving sensation that something was materializing, creeping out from the edges of her vision. She could almost sense the swirling grit of a desert wind brushing against her ankles, an impossible tactile hallucination. Shaking her head, she ended the recording. Enough for now. She made a note in her journal. Reading text out loud triggers bizarre illusions. She turned off her lamp and went to bed. That night, the nightmares returned, more vivid than before. She dreamed of pale figures moaning and crawling across an endless dune, their eyes glowing in desperation. She recognized phrases from the manuscript, etched on broken columns around them. A monstrous silhouette overshadowed them all, with smoke pouring from its mouth. She woke up at 4 a.m, gasping, sweat-soaked, trembling. A powerful, unexplainable fear clung to her chest, as though she were still in that place. She couldn't sleep again, so she sat in bed scrolling through articles on her phone, hoping to distract herself. Within a few days, Elena made partial breakthroughs in translating more of the text. It told of a civilization from centuries past that worshipped a nameless power, though Tsar seemed to be an epithet for that powersome embodiment of knowledge, taken to a terrifying extreme. The text referenced cataclysmic events, painting an image of entire cities swallowed by sand. There were lines that seemed to describe illusions or portals bridging the present and the past. One cryptic passage proclaimed, "Speak, and the gate shall open, unveiling the horrors that dwell beyond time." During one afternoon session, Elena noticed something disturbing. Every so often, the ink on the parchment glowed faintly if the lighting changed, or if she shifted her vantage point. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she stared longer, she was certain the text was shimmering with a subtle luminescence. She tried taking photos with her phone, but the effect didn't show up in the pictures. She tried moving her light source, nothing. Yet when she bent close enough that she could smell the dusty aroma of centuries-old parchment, the glow returned, just beneath the surface of the dried ink. Concerned about her mental state, she reined herself in. Stress could cause hallucinations. She had to be careful. Maybe she should take a break, get some air. She made herself a chamomile tea, hoping its calming warmth would bring her some peace. However, the rational part of her admitted that something inexplicable was happening. The text encoded more than mere words. She was convinced it carried a power that responded to a reader's attention. Her phone chirped, snapping her from her thoughts. It was Samir. "I found something," he said. "Meet me at the museum." She hurried to gather her coat and left her apartment, the city's dusk sky turning purple overhead. The ride to the museum was nerve-wracking. The traffic lights seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision. She arrived, anxious but also eager for answers. Tamir led her to a dim reading nook. He had a collection of texts open on the table. I uncovered references to Zahar in some obscure volumes. He began, adjusting his glasses. It's called The Devourer of Eras. My guess is that this text you're working on might be linked to legends of a cult that believe they could summon living history. He tapped a paragraph. My research suggests they used incantations to physically manifest events from the past to bring them forward in time. He chuckled, though it was humorless. Sounds outlandish. But these old stories say that once you start reading the incantations, they fuse with your psyche. Elena's blood ran cold. His words aligned all too well with her own experiences. The illusions, the sense of a desert wind breathing across her face, the nightmares. They believed reading these texts could warp reality? She asked. Samir nodded, or at least your perception of it. She realized her heart was pounding. She recounted her intense dreams, the odd illusions, and how the text seemed to glow. Samir listened, his lips pressed thin, his cautious expression betraying both curiosity and a hint of fear. As they spoke, the museum halls seemed oddly hushed, the overhead lights simmering quietly. Samir gave her a final stern look. This is unprecedented. If you feel unsafe, you should stop working on it immediately. But Elena couldn't do that. Something in her pulled her forward. She wanted, needed, to decode the entire text. After all, maybe the phenomenon was only a trick of suggestion, her imagination feeding off the text's eerie content. She tried to reassure him, though her voice faltered. Back home, she settled into her desk once more. She streamed classical music softly to drown out her nervous thoughts. As she carefully worked, she realized there was a section of the text she hadn't fully explored. A block of dense writing near the end, adorned with unusual markings. The script was smaller, more compressed, as if the scribe's hand had trembled with urgency. Elena, heart pounding, began matching known words. Phonetic patterns emerged, and she pieced them meticulously together. The text described a ritual. The speaker, by reading a specific incantation, could open a portal into memory, effectively summoning a living reenactment of any historical scene recorded within. The writing cautioned that, once invoked, the illusions fed on the summoner's fear, drawing strength from that psychic energy. Each time the illusions manifested, they grew more tangible. They shall hunger for your mind, one line read, and in devouring your fear, they become real. Lightning flickered outside her window, illuminating her reflection. For a moment she saw not her own face, but the face of a hooded figure, gaunt, with hollow eyes. She jumped, nearly knocking over a glass of water. The reflection reverted to normal in the next flash. Her pulse pounded in her temples. She pressed on, refusing to surrender to panic. She needed to catalog the entire incantation. Violent peals of thunder rolled across the city sky. She couldn't help but read it aloud, softly, barely more than a whisper. Something compelled her. The phrases tumbled from her lips. With each syllable, her living room lights flickered. The shadows on the wall elongated, twisting, as though they were opening to reveal ancient corridors. The air grew thick, as if swelling with a desert wind, and she felt an unmistakable, graty swirl against her skin. She froze, biting her tongue. Her heart hammered. Had she unleashed something? Then, just as suddenly, the sensation vanished. The lights steadied. The droning hum of the refrigerator returned to fill the silence. She let out a trembling breath, her mind spinning. The incantation was translated, and the past, if she believed the text, could manifest at her very command. She wondered, dazed, if she had a choice in the matter anymore. The text had found her, and it wasn't letting go. That night, Elena slept with the manuscript locked away in a metal case lined with protective fabric. Yet even sealed away, it pervaded her dreams. This time she dreamed about a crumbling library, countless scrolls turned to dust, and a robed figure whispering in an ancient script that made her eyes bleed. She woke with an agonized gasp, hands clamped over her own mouth. The next morning she resolved to confront the phenomenon head-on. If the text truly allowed glimpses of history, perhaps she could choose a benign scene, a peaceful historical event, and see what happened. It was reckless, but she felt compelled to test it. Otherwise, she might never rest again. She spent hours looking for a reference to a simpler moment in the text, eventually finding a short passage about a blessing under starlit pillars, presumably a holy ceremony in ancient times. She pieced together the relevant incantation, then sat at her desk, drawing in a deep, unsteady breath. Her voice quivered as she chanted. At first, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped as though an arctic wind swept through the room. Shadows wavered around her. The corners of her vision blurred, and it was as if each wall of her apartment gave way to reveal a colossal temple courtyard under a vast night sky. The smell of incense drifted past her nose, mingling with the desert scent of clay and parched stone. For a few heartbeats, she stood transfixed, watching robed men and women move rhythmically in prayer. Their gestures were fluid, their chants soft. The illusions were so vivid she thought she could reach out and brush her fingers against the rough-hewn walls. But as she watched, the scene flared with discord. The robed figures singing became frantic. One of them turned to Elena directly, eyes wide and hollow, screaming a single word. She couldn't decipher it, but it was laced with horror. A wind kicked up, swirling sand in the courtyard. The illusions faltered, flickered, and vanished. She found herself back in her candlelight apartment, arms shaking, heart thunderous. Blood trickled from her nose. She touched it in shock. The illusions had nearly overwhelmed her. Her entire body trembled with adrenaline. She realized she had to figure out how to stop it before it spiraled further. Over the next several days, the manifestation stubbornly returned in disjointed fragments. She would see glimpses of that temple courtyard in mirrors or windows. The robed figure's anguished face appeared in reflections on her coffee mug. The sense of being in multiple times at once eroded her sanity. Even the city itself looked different to her eyes, as if foreign, overshadowed by ancient architecture layered in ghostly outlines. She finally spoke her fears to Samar, whose alarm was palpable. They agreed they needed to contain whatever power was leaking from the document. In their frantic search for solutions, Samar discovered a footnote in one of the archaic volumes, referencing a closing incantation, a final set of phrases designed to banish illusions of the past. It was said to be a precarious procedure, only possible if the summoner was willing to relinquish the knowledge gained and break the connection. To seal the door, one must forfeit the path, the text reportedly stated. They reasoned that finishing the translation might reveal this banishing verse. But finishing the translation meant also wading deeper into the textual labyrinth. Elena's mental state continued to fracture. She'd see a swirl of sand in broad daylight, only to realize it was a pile of fallen leaves in her peripheral vision. She'd pass a reflective surface and see not herself, but an ancient figure scowling in condemnation. Still, she pushed on, driven to decode every line. It felt like the text gnawed at her mind, feeding on her mounting terror. She recognized an irony in her situation. The more she stepped away, the more unhinged her everyday reality became. The only path forward was to finish the incantation. At last, late one afternoon, the final piece slid into place. The swirling script near the end of the parchment resolved into legible words. She had found it. The banishing ritual. Words that could close the portal between the present and the illusions of the past, severing their tether to her consciousness. She stared at the lines, her breath catching in her throat. It demanded that she renounce all knowledge gleaned from the text. She had to speak a vow that would lock away this forbidden lore, ensuring she could never retrieve it. If she failed, the illusions would continue feeding until Zahara, the devourer of Eris, claims the life of the summoner as a vessel, the text warned. Lena tried to Alina to act immediately. She phoned Samir, telling him she had discovered the banishing incantation. He insisted on coming over to ensure she wasn't alone if something went wrong. Twilight had fallen by the time he arrived, the city's lights casting a dull glow through her windows. They carefully placed the original parchment on a wood stand. Samir discreetly recorded the moment on his phone, as if anticipating this could provide some form of proof, or at least a reference if things went awry. Elena's voice trembled as she began reciting the final lines. The language flowed from her lips with eerie fluency, as though it had always been lodged in some dark, hidden corridor of her mind. Immediately, a smoky haze filled her apartment, coiling from the corners and swirling near the ceiling. The leftover illusions sprang to life in a chaotic swirl. She saw the temple courtyard again, the robed figures wailing, columns crumbling. Then came the desert plain from her nightmares, the moaning silhouettes creeping closer, their eyes blazing in spectral light. Thunder roared outside, shaking the windows. Samir held a trembling flashlight, illuminating the swirling gloom. The illusions grew so dense that Elena felt caught between worlds, as if the boundaries of her apartment had dissolved. Her voice strained as she forced out each word of the incantation. She felt her mind unraveling, while an indescribable presence loomed behind her. She knew it was Zar, feeding on her terror, resisting her attempt to banish it. A violent gust of wind whipped her hair and sand pelted her skin. She coughed, choking on the dryness. But Elena pressed on, tears streaming from her eyes as she pronounced the vow. She would forsake the knowledge, seal it away forever. The moment she spoke the last fateful sentence, a piercing cry tore through the dark, rattling the glass in the windows. The illusions flickered like dying flames. She felt a surge of force crackling through the apartment, an electrical hum intensifying until her ears rang. She squeezed her eyes shut, convinced she might be torn apart. Then, with a sudden pop of air displaced, the swirling visions vanished. The apartment light bulbs steadied, no longer flickering. Her living room reappeared, ordinary and quiet except for the echo of her ragged breathing. Smear lowered the flashlight. Dust motes floated lazily in the beam. She wiped tears from her face, half expecting the illusions to reassert themselves, but there was only stillness. She turned to the parchment, but the text no longer shimmered. The words themselves seemed to have faded, blurred as if a glass pane had fogged over. Slowly, lines of script became illegible, dissolving from her memory. She tried to recall the incantation's intricacies, but they slipped through her mind like water through cupped hands. She had done exactly what the text required, forfeit the knowledge to seal the door. Whatever horrors lay in those pages were locked away behind the vow. Samira exhaled with relief, stepping carefully around her desk. "Are you all right?" he asked. Elena nodded, though she felt hollow. She closed her eyes, searching her mind for traces of what she had learned. The place where that knowledge dwelled was now a gaping emptiness. She recognized bits and pieces, a few words, a hazy recollection, but the specifics were gone. She supposed this was the price, a partial oblivion that might grant her peace. She told Samir she was done, that the text had drained enough from her. She wanted the museum to store it away, locked up, away from curious eyes. The two of them carefully placed the parchment back into its container. Something faintly ominous lingered in the air, as though the artifact recognized it had been silenced. But it had not been destroyed. It was too ancient, too resilient. Perhaps it merely waited for the next unsuspecting soul to pry open its mysteries. In the weeks that followed, Elena's dreams returned to normal. She found no more improbable illusions lurking around corners, no ghostly shapes and mirrors. Occasionally she woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding as she strained to recall a fleeting image of desert sands or hooded figures. But the memory never stayed. She had given it up. In time she regained her composure, though she bore the invisible scars of those uncanny experiences. She occasionally met Samir for coffee. He reminded her that the text still existed, locked in the museum vault, though the museum's official stance was to keep it hidden. They had no intention of displaying it or releasing any translations. Samir admitted the entire staff was unsettled by the events that had transpired, yet they couldn't simply destroy a relic of historical import. Elena felt conflicted. She had glimpsed wonders and terrors that transcended ordinary human understanding. Part of her yearned to reclaim that knowledge, if only to confirm she hadn't gone insane. But any time she tried to recall the incantations, her mind grew hazy. She recognized this as the effect of the vow. With it came assurance that she had sealed away the mind-bending illusion. She clung to that assurance when nightmares occasionally threatened to surface. Still, sometimes, late at night, she would wake with the phantom taste of desert dust in her mouth. In those moments of half-awake confusion, she sensed a presence lingering outside the edge of her awareness. She reasoned it was merely her rattled psychology, the natural residue of trauma. And so she would settle her breathing, close her eyes, and tell herself, "It is over." For the most part, that promise held true. Life went on, days passing with a renewed appreciation for normalcy. Yet somewhere in the quiet, back rooms of the museum's vault, the faintest shimmer of ancient ink still pulsed on that parchment. It awaited an unwary reader's gaze, holding stories of lost civilizations and unstoppable horrors, tethered to reality by the simple act of translation. Only the hush of secrecy contained it, and Elena, though free, would forever be tethered by the memory of how fragile the walls between past and present could become once the words were awakened.